Welcome to The Details with Elliott, Connie, and Adam Frower. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics going on in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. Okay, welcome back to The Details with Elliott and Adam. And so, Adam, here's what I want to get into today, right? So you and I have been talking for a really long time as we talk about research and teach and write about solution-focused brief therapy, like the power of words and the power of language and the impact of those things. And what I want to talk about today is this thing that's going on right now called cancel culture. And first of all, I'm going to just come out and say it. I don't love the name cancel culture. I think what I prefer is accountability culture. And the reason that I say that is because I think what's happening now is people are being held accountable for the words that they choose and the actions that they demonstrate. And very often, and you guys see it, right? You see it all the time. People will post racially insensitive or in some cases outrageously bigoted content on social media. And then like their employer finds out about it and they get fired from their job, and people refer to that as like cancel culture. And look, I'm not saying that there should be like a punishment, like you should be fired from your job. But what I am saying is like, I'm the leader of a company that employs multiple people. If on social media, I saw one of my employees posting racially insensitive or outrageously bigoted content, I would feel as though I had no choice but to fire them. For two reasons. Number one, what they're doing is not on brand. And number two, they represent my company. So if the world sees that they represent my company and they're misrepresenting my company's ideals in that way, then my company may experience, like, people will not use my company anymore. Like, companies have to get rid of these people to support their entity. Like, they have to get rid of these people to protect their entity. And I will say, I've said this forever, the civil rights movement was not effective because one day white people woke up and started realizing, oh, this was the right thing to do. The civil rights movement became effective when they realized you have to hit people in the bottom line to impact change. So the best example is the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks famously sparked that by refusing to get out of her seat. People kind of think that like the Rosa Parks incident happened and then they changed the rules on the buses. That's not true. Rosa Parks was actually preceded a month before by another woman whose name I can't recall at the moment. So that happened because the woman truly was tired. Rosa Parks wasn't tired. It was orchestrated. She was the secretary of the local chapter of the NAACP, and she was chosen to get on the bus and refused to get off. That sparked the movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., which was the Montgomery bus boycott. That lasted 384 days. And in those 384 days, multiple white-owned bus companies went out of business. And then the remaining bus companies said, we cannot survive without our black customers coming back, so we have to lift this stupid segregation on the bus rule. Like, that's how it happened. So what's happening now in cancel culture is like, if you say something horribly racist, right? And I'm gonna say, like, if the CEO of Nike says something horribly racist and someone says, you need to apologize, and he says, no, I'm not apologizing, I believe that, then all of the black people are going to say, we are no longer purchasing Nike, i.e. cancel culture. But it's not canceling. You're just being held accountable to your ideals. And I'm not going to spend money to support a company that believes in my second-class citizenship or that believes in my oppression. And what would happen is, like, after however many weeks or months, Nike not making as much money, they would have to change their policy. Papa John's went through that when there was a recording of the Papa John's CEO using the N-word. And black people said, we are no longer purchasing Papa John's pizza. And they had to remove that CEO from that position. So it's not cancel culture. It's just about accountability. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it is because you and I have obsessed about language and the power of words for as long as we have known one another. But also, I do hear people, usually white people, talking about, it seems like everybody's overly sensitive and it's an infringement on my First Amendment rights. So I wanted to hear what your take on that was, and then have a conversation about like the true power of language.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously introducing a really heavy topic, so I think it's super important that we talk about it. And I do think that you're making a really important distinction between canceling versus holding people accountable. And I think you also mentioned, and I would say predominantly probably white privileged people are kind of reacting to this culture and saying it's an infringement on my right. I should be able to say whatever it is that I want to say. And I think that in a lot of sense, there is truth to both sides. And hear me out on this, right? On the one hand, that is true. They should be able to say whatever it is they want to say.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But on the other hand, they don't get to necessarily choose the consequence of what they say, right?
100%.
They get to make a choice, but oftentimes there are natural consequences that follow. And I don't get to necessarily dictate what the consequence of my choice is. As a parent, my children probably could say a lot of times, that's not fair that I got that punishment. And I have to redirect them and say, let's think about how we got to the punishment. And only when they start to take accountability does the punishment lighten a bit. And I think that's a really important component of all of this, is that I think sometimes people take umbrage with cancel culture because they say, in essence, you're judging the totality of who that person is on one thing or one statement. And I think what I would say in response to that is a couple of things. If someone is willing to say something that publicly, then it probably isn't an isolated thought or belief or statement. It's something that they stand behind enough to put it out into the world. So I think that's one thing, is that we're not just taking in isolation one experience. I think in addition, we have to look at it in the culture of white privilege. We have to look at it and say, yeah, but even if that is one thing that this person has done, it's coming on the heels of many other things that other people have done. And so this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Either way, that person or that entity should be held responsible. We are each responsible for the words that come out of our mouths, for the behavior that comes out of our bodies, for the thoughts that are in our heads. We are responsible for those things. And when other people react to those things, they are entitled to that reaction just as much as you are entitled to the initial act. I think it's important that we look at the entire interaction going back and forth and the impact that it has on both parties.
You know what? So as we're talking about this, I think about the very first time I learned about cancel culture, and it might have been the first time that anything like this went viral. It's certainly the first time I can remember. I don't know if you can remember or not, but there was a woman. She was a white woman. I think she was a marketing executive, and she was going on a plane to South Africa, and she put on Twitter, "I'm going to South Africa," and I can't remember exactly what the tweet was, but something like, "I'm going to South Africa, and I hope like I don't catch AIDS from a black person." She put that on Twitter just before the plane takes off. She's flying from the U.S. to South Africa, and when she's on the plane, she's completely oblivious that this tweet has gone viral. And when she lands, the news media in Johannesburg is waiting for her, and there's like a swarm of news media. And her company had already released a press statement saying that she is fired because she does not represent that company. Those ideas do not represent that company well. Now, I'm not in any way saying like, good, that's what's supposed to happen, whatever. But I am saying I do believe she has every right to put on Twitter whatever she would like. But as you very well put, I mean, she can't choose what the consequences are for what she put on Twitter. And I think people get that confused. Like, I should be able to put whatever I want on Twitter without any consequences. And people are saying I shouldn't have any consequences. Like, no, you're not. The consequences and what you put on Twitter, no one is trying to restrict what you put on Twitter, but you can't put hate speech on Twitter and expect there not to be some sort of a consequence. Which brings me to, I just can't help but think like the power of words. Like, this is like an unbelievably powerful thing. And one of the things that happens, like you and I were just talking before this, our company is by far, in terms of number of people that we train per month, the largest training organization in the world in solution-focused brief therapy. And it's not even close. And one of the number one things that people ask all the time is like, do you really believe that solution-focused brief therapy can impact a client or can like solve a problem in 1 or 2 or 3 sessions? And I always am like, yes, because words are really, really, really powerful. And if we believe that words are powerful enough to cancel, then that must mean by proxy words are powerful enough to empower, because you couldn't have one without the other. And I think it's such an interesting conversation to have, which is why I wanted to have it with you. That, first of all, I don't think we're talking about canceling. I think we're talking about accountability. And secondly, one of the things we learned is I could, and I just told you, right? Like we got the largest company right now teaching solution-focused brief therapy, and people love what we do and whatever. I could pick up this phone, I could send a tweet, and it could all be over tomorrow morning. And what's a tweet? 140 characters? I could send a tweet with 140 characters and wake up tomorrow morning and it's all over, because that's how powerful words are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as we were talking then and just listening to you now about the power of words, I think there's 2 things that are really important to that. And it isn't, as it relates especially to solution focus, one of the things that we really talk about a lot is that language really is co-constructed. That as I, as a speaker, put words out there, the person listening is going to respond in a certain way and clarify in a certain way. And we're going to come to an agreement on what it means, right? And that is happening always in every conversation that we have, is that there's kind of this underlying negotiation about what particular words mean. And I think that's one of the things that's being left out of this conversation about cancel culture, is that in some sense, the speaker is saying, I should be able to throw out there whatever words I want, and you should know what I mean by it. You should understand. Oftentimes you hear people make excuses and say, I didn't mean that.
Right.
I think one of the things that we have to remember every time we say anything is that the listener and the responder has as much influence over what the words mean as the speaker does, because we are constantly co-constructing language and meaning. And so I think in solution-focused brief therapy, it's really incumbent upon us as clinicians to listen so respectfully and try to understand what the client means and clarify what they mean, instead of trying to impose our own meaning on it. Because there is always this co-construction that's happening that I think in this conversation about cancel culture is being overlooked. So I think that's one thing that we have to remember, is that it is co-constructed. The second thing I think that's really important, and you highlighted it as well, in one word can be really powerful. It could be the difference between, you waking up tomorrow and the business being gone, and you waking up tomorrow and everybody being interested in what you're saying. And I think that that is really, really important. And it should then point us as clinicians to really being purposeful about each specific word that we choose. And in solution-focused brief therapy, we are guided by which words we choose because we listen to the client and we try to pick up their important words. We don't try to infuse our own language into it. And I think that's another parallel to this conversation, is that when speaking the words, we need to be abundantly clear that somebody is going to be picking those words up.
Right.
So we're responsible for what comes out of our mouths, not because of what they're going to make of it, but because it came out of our mouths.
Right. And if there's one thing that I would want people to know, all people, like regardless of whether or not you're a clinician or not, regardless of whether or not you're in this field or not, the words you use matter and impact people constantly, absolutely constantly. And I think we forget that a lot. I think that we forget that words matter, and we start thinking that like problems and obstacles and fears and anxiety matter, and they actually don't. Like they actually don't. And I can tell you a really funny story. I've loved Mr. Rogers. I need to go watch that movie actually, because growing up I was a huge fan of Mr. Rogers, and I used to wake up on Saturday morning and I would make a bowl of cereal and I'd go sit in my living room and eat my cereal. And Mr. Rogers used to say on his show, like, I love you just the way you are. And I remember feeling better as like an 8-year-old kid sitting on my couch listening to Mr. Rogers. Like, I can remember hearing that and thinking, what a good thing that he would say such a cool thing. Like, I really remember hearing that and feeling that when he would say it. And I think as clinicians and as people, we have to remember the words we use matter. The words that we use, in some sense, become like the tape player that happens in the receiver's head after we use them. And it's really, really important that we remember that. So when people tell me, like, do you think your sessions can make a difference in a client's life? Hell yeah, I think they can, because words matter. How many times, Adam, have you been doing therapy with somebody and the client was shocked by the words that came out of their mouth as a result of a question you asked them, and their lives were never the same because of that? That's how powerful words are. It's magical. Like Steve DeShazer wrote a book called Words Were Originally Magic, because that is actually magic. That is a powerful thing.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm remembering and realizing, right? So we did a research study. I was doing a microanalysis research study, which basically pulls apart the language of conversation. And I was doing a research study with Janet Bavelis and Sarah Smock, and we were looking at 2 different kinds of therapy, right? We were looking at solution-focused therapy, and we were looking at cognitive behavioral therapy. And one of the really striking things that I discovered in doing that research is it didn't really matter what kind of therapist we were looking at. Either kind of therapist, they would typically, what we would call, select or basically pick up or repeat between 5 and 7% of what the client said. So I'm listening to all these things that the client brings in, and I really only get to choose 5 to 7% to focus on. So I have to be really, really intentional about what 5% of the words I'm going to focus on. And one of the things that was really striking about this research is that CBT therapists, cognitive behavioral therapists, they did exactly what the theory says that they should do, right? They were looking for faulty cognitions. They were looking for maladaptive thoughts, right? And the language that they chose to pick up was reflective of those deficiencies in people. Whereas solution-focused brief therapists did exactly what their theory or approach told them to do. They would pick up on strengths. They would pick up on instances where things were a little bit better, right? And so both clinicians did exactly what the theories that they were working from told them to do. But it didn't matter that they were following their theory so much, because they really only got to select 5% of what was spoken. And I think there's really a message for all of us in that people who are listening to all the things that we say, they might really only be able to pick up on 5% of what comes out of our mouths. And we need to be very intentional about those 5% of the words, which is really one of the reasons why I chose to work from this solution-focused perspective. Because if the 5% of the words that I get to listen to and really focus on are about strengths and about resources and about hope, what better things could we do in order, as you were saying before, to really shift someone's life in a positive way? If they're so used to hearing the 95% of things, and for the first time, they hear somebody reflect back to them the 5% of positive, hopeful, enthusiastic things, what a difference that could make in someone's life. And so we really have the ability to positively impact someone's life if we are very intentional about those 5% of the words that we use.
Right. And I don't think we're intentional enough, like as people, because I think we haven't fully bought into the idea that words are quite powerful. And I think we should, like, if we're only going to be able to pick up 5%, 10%, we have to be very intentional about what we pick up and be very responsible and accountable to what we pick up. You know, and it's funny, as I teach counselors and have been for a very long time, when a session doesn't go well, I almost never, as I'm sitting here thinking, I can't think of a single time when someone said, the session didn't go very well because I didn't do a good job. It's always because like the client was X, Y, or Z, but maybe it's because you didn't pick up the right 5%. Maybe it's because you were not intentional enough. Maybe it's because you were not focused. When I do therapy, as you know, like I am very focused on language, like a laser. And oftentimes I'll show video to people and they'll say, I've just never seen anybody that focused before. And I actually had someone tell me that their professor told them that the only thing that matters is the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes. You can do anything you want to in the middle. And I was like, whoa, like that's craziness. People come to us because like their lives are falling apart. They come to us because their marriage is in shambles. They're afraid that their son or daughter is off the rails. Like people come to us in despair. The very least I can give them is intentionality. Like the very least I can give them is focus. Now I can't be perfect, and I don't mean to imply that like every single client I see, I help, because I don't think anybody could make that claim, but it won't be because I didn't give it every single thing that I got, and I didn't focus all of my attention on trying to be successful with them.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking, then one other thought came to my mind, and I think it's really about like none of us are going to be perfect, right? We can try really, really hard to be intentional, but we're going to slip up and we're going to make mistakes. We're going to use the wrong word, or somebody's going to hear it in a way that we didn't intend. But again, because it's co-constructed, their reality makes it our reality. And so there are going to be times where we're going to get it wrong. And I think that's one of the mistakes in this counterculture conversation as well, is that people kind of put all of the emphasis on this one statement, where in reality, if people would, again, going back to that word of accountability, if people would just take accountability and say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize when I said it that it would mean that. But now that I've taken a minute, I can see something that I couldn't see before. And now I understand maybe it does mean something because I said it to a certain person or a certain group of people. And because we're co-constructing, it means something. And I think in reality, both in therapy and in life, because we're focusing on the importance of language, sometimes the most important thing we can say is, I'm sorry, I did that one wrong. And I should take accountability for it. And I should try again. I should say something different and say, I now understand, and I'm sorry that I did what I did.
It's funny because you made me think about, as a Black man, I have experienced being on the receiving end of inappropriate, offensive, or outright bigoted comments. And when I point them out to the person who spoke, and I don't have any problem calling people on their shit when they do this sort of thing, as you know, the rupture is not usually the original offense. The rupture is usually how they are responded to the offense. Because if somebody does something and I say, hey, that was a little bit insensitive, and let me tell you how I heard that as an African-American man, if the response is, oh my gosh, I did not know that, thanks for pointing it out and I'll do better, you really don't experience it as hurtful. But when people try to explain it away, get defensive, or tell me that I'm being too sensitive, the rupture becomes very hurtful. And I think that's just part of being accountable to our actions. I may one day put something on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I put things on social media every day. I may one day put something that is insensitive or inappropriate, and I may offend women or some religious group or whatever. And if someone points it out to me, it is on me to say, I didn't know that. Or if I take a principled position and say, well, I believe it, so I'm going to leave it there, then I have to accept the consequences that come with that, which may include people not hiring me to give lectures anymore, or book publishers not wanting to be associated with my name for writing books, or whatever the case may be. But I think it is time we realize that words are incredibly powerful and we're accountable to them. And this is not a free speech issue. No one is saying you shouldn't have a Twitter account, and no one is saying you can't put anything you want on that Twitter account. We're simply saying you're accountable to what you put in there. And the same thing is true in the clinical room. You are accountable to the words you use as a professional, and you're accountable to the words you don't. And you're accountable to what words the client uses. You're accountable to how you select them and how you use them in your therapy.
Again, just one word that comes to mind is humility, right? And it's listening when someone comes back and says, the words that you chose were hurtful to me. It takes a lot of humility to say, let me reevaluate that. Let me look at it again. And it takes even more humility to say, I'm sorry about what I said. And so I think you're right. I think there is a time where we apologize. And I think there are other times where perhaps we just stand up and we say, no, actually, I'm standing by what I said. And you now have a choice about how you're going to interact with it. And so I think the other thing that we're not saying is you shouldn't be able to say whatever it is you want to say. And you shouldn't be able to stand by what you say. You absolutely have the right to do those things. But again, kind of wrapping back to where we began, you may not get to choose the consequence that comes from the humble approach or the confident approach. You can choose which one you're going to take, but you don't get to choose the consequences.
So Adam, every time we do one of these, so we're now on episode 3, we have like a challenge for the audience, right? So what should we challenge the audience with? Because what I want to say to them is I want them to pay attention to the language that they use and the language they pick up as they talk to the people they talk to, whether or not that is their clients, their family members, but just be aware of the language that you use and the language that you choose not to use when you're having conversations with people. Because it's an interesting thing when you start paying attention to language. Like one example is I have an aunt, her name is Lenny, and she does not like it when I curse. And, you know, every now and then.
Done that twice today.
Every now and then, she listened to a previous episode and yelled at me. She's like, can you not curse when you do this? I'm like, nah, man, it's just how I am. But so we recently just drove to Chicago together and it was like 14 hours in a car. And I'm intentionally choosing what words I use and what words I don't because I'm aware of the receiver. And it's out of respect for her that you do that. So like, I think it's an interesting thing for you guys to pay attention to the words you use when you're around certain people versus the words you don't, because language is so powerful and we're constantly making choices on how we communicate the ideas that we have, but we're often not on a meta level analyzing the words that we use. And I think that would be an interesting way for people to spend some time just kind of thinking about what words do I select when I'm around my partner versus when I'm around my children versus when I'm around my best friend versus when I'm around my, you know what I mean? Like to see how that selection process varies would be fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree. And it's interesting because as you were talking, I realized I'm regularly on the flip side. You know me, I never curse. And oftentimes people will accidentally curse around me, and regularly people apologize to me. And again, I think that we all do this to a certain extent. Is even if we make that mistake, we realize, wait a second, my audience is going to respond to this, and people regularly are apologizing to me for the words they use. And so I think also, in addition to that challenge of listening or paying attention to the words you use, I think there's also the counter side of the challenge, which is listen to the words that other people use that you choose to pick up. Right. Why do you use the words that you use that other people used previously?
You know what's funny, Adam? So we're gonna end with a little bit of a funny story. I've been around you long enough. I don't think I'm terribly foul-mouthed, but I don't apologize to you when you're a grown man. You can handle things. But one of the funniest things, so I'm aware that I have never heard a curse word come out of your mouth, and I've known you longer than a decade. But it was really funny. So all of you listening, I was at Adam's house one time staying with him and his wonderful family, and his sister-in-law, his wife's sister, and her 2 kids were coming to visit at the same time. We go to the airport to pick up his wife's sister and her 2 children, and they get in the car and are listening to Tupac and like rapping. And I was like, what is going on here? What is happening that these kids are allowed to like say curse words in rap songs? The craziest experience ever. I was like, wait a minute. I didn't think the Throwers did anything like this. And here are these, and I think your nephew at the time was probably like 14 or something. And it was like, what is happening right now that he's listening to Tupac Shakur of all people? Does anybody think this is inappropriate? Is this bad? This has got to be bad.
It's true. Again, I'm not his parent. I'm not going to control him. He gets to do what his parents say he can do.
Oh my gosh. Well, all right, that's it. Episode 3 is a wrap. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And I really hope that this is making a difference to you.
Thank you, everybody.